this morning for the Ellen White Seminar. Awesome. And we're always glad to have Pastor Greg back. And this will probably be one of the last seminars that he will do here for a while. We might get him to do one more seminar in the fall on the sanctuary. But we appreciate Pastor Greg. He apostatized and went down to Yale and Graham. We'll forgive him for that. And we got something very special for Greg because we appreciate him and we love him, and we're glad to have his wife Melissa with us today. But Pastor Mike, if you're here, would you share with us what we got in honor of Pastor Greg being our pastor?
Pastor Keith and I and a few other members, we were talking about Greg and Melissa's years of service here. Wasn't it wonderful to have them here all that time? Greg and I have had some great chats. I'm going to miss those chats, but he's not that far away, so we've still stayed in touch. But anyway, we were talking, Pastor Greg and I and a few of the members, we thought we need to get something very special to commemorate his time here and to let him know that we will always appreciate his service here. And so we got him a plaque. In fact, we have a slide to show you here, if we can get that on the screen. Brian can work his magic. There you go. This is a picture of the plaque. And Greg, notice it says, presented to Greg Howell, in appreciation of your faithful ministry and loving service, 2007 and 2010, by your Puyallup Adventist Church family. And we found out that that was your favorite scripture text, or at least one of them. So we had that put on there. And look at it well, kind of etch that in your memory, because you're not going to see the plaque till Monday or Tuesday, because I forgot to pick it up yesterday. I can't believe it. So, yeah, you're so... You remembered, the plaque wasn't, but anyway, brother, we really appreciate you. You heard all this applause, and we're just glad you're still close.
I do just want to take a minute to thank you guys. I had a fantastic 2-year life. I had a chance to be with you guys. It was a privilege, it was an honor. And it was one of my funnest ministry experiences so far. So thank you guys for being awesome, for being so loving, so open, so welcoming. And I just hope that just being down the road, just as we guys drop in every once in a while, we can always use you in Graham, use you in Yelm. So I want to thank you again this morning. If you weren't here for the first part of the series, we are going to be looking a little bit at Ellen White. And we talked, first of all, in this early morning session, a little bit about what she was like in her own world, the context, the history, and the place that she lived and worked in, where she was all about, the different things that she went through, that she lived in. And we also talked about what made her stand out from her peers, from the other people around her. We also talked about why she very much evidenced her call as a prophet of God. We talked about some of the evidences and the reasons why I believe she had that gift. If you didn't get any of that stuff, please do see me. I'll be able to get you the manuscript or even the PowerPoint slideshow if you want to kind of look through that. I'd be more than willing to pass it on. But continuing on from here, this second section, I want to look a little bit more at what we do with her now. This is something that's got to be brought out because this is what I want to try and get us to learn this morning. And I believe this, to me, is the more crucial part of what do we do with Ellen White. This morning, what we kind of want to look at is going to be what many Adventists have missed about Ellen White. And I say, well, we missed simply because there's obviously people among us who've had bad experiences with her. We know that in the church, sometimes she's been used as a battering ram rather than a help. And so we want to look and see what exactly we missed. What happened here? Why did she turn into that? We also are going to look at how to understand her writings as she meant them to be understood. Obviously, we don't have the author here anymore. She's not here to explain it to us when we have questions. So how we read it is going to be determine how we see her. And there's some rules and there's some tools that we can use to make sure we're getting the most out of her writings. Also, we want to avoid the common errors that sometimes crop up when reading her material. I'm going to work through some of those. I won't go into the detail here, but there are things that we can do to keep ourselves from misinterpreting the text. Adventures in missing the mark. Is Ellen White really as legalistic, boring, or irrelevant as some people make her out to be? I want to look at that this morning, because to me, that's one of the things that I grew up in the church and Ellen White was not relevant for me. Whatever it was done, however she was presented to me, I looked at that and said, you know what, I don't need her. Even when I finally started getting interested in church and started believing that there was something to Christianity that I wanted to be a part of, I still looked at her and said, but I don't need her. That was part of my growing up experience. I mean, I've been in the church since I was in cradle roll, since I was born, and I didn't like her. I'll be frank about it. Why not? What happened? Where were things going wrong? I want to look first, though, at some people who knew her directly. And they're not going to be the people you would expect. I'm not going to talk about any of the pioneers. I'm not going to talk about her family. I'm not going to talk about the people in the church who didn't like her when she was alive. I'm going to talk about what it was like to be Ellen White's neighbor. Because to me, it speaks volumes. After her funeral, it says many of the neighbors came by to the family to pay their respects. The people who lived around her came and said, we want to tell you that the best memories of her were all the times that she would give them fruits and vegetables from her garden. She was a good neighbor. She showed up at the door with tomatoes, with fruit. And you liked to see her coming down the road. They said, we enjoyed what she did for us. And what is amazing is they go on to say, all we'll remember her as is that sweet little old lady who always gave us fruits and vegetables and just couldn't stop talking about Jesus. Now these are non-Adventist people, just regular folks who didn't know anything about the church, didn't know anything about her per se. Their impression of her was that she was a nice little old lady who just couldn't stop talking about Jesus. What are we missing? Honestly, I mean, they were just normal folks, not Adventists, just neighbors, and that was their impression of her. Not many of us see her that way, do we? When I think Ellen White growing up, I didn't think of a nice little old lady. I thought of the mean old lady that was looking down her nose at me and saying, why aren't you wearing a suit in church? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? You know you better not do that. You're going to go to hell. I thought, man, I don't want this, but this is the impression I got. We don't see Ellen White the way these people did. We see her as legalistic, sour-faced, condemning, judgmental, boring. That's a fact. A lot of people come out with that impression of Ellen White. There's a disconnect there, because people who didn't know anything about her thought she was great. People who should have known her better came out for some reason thinking she was terrible. Why? What are we missing? Where have we gone wrong? We've made sometimes some errors, I think, in what we apply to her. There have been people who've said that belief in her as a prophet is a requirement for membership. Okay? And she actually fought against this concept many times. I'm not saying that belief in the spirit of prophecy is wrong. She actually stood up for that and said, we believe in the spiritual gifts that the church was given in the New Testament period. But she warned against people who had problems with believing her prophecies and said, don't keep them out of the church because they haven't fully seen the light on my writings. Let them come in, and the Spirit will work, it will move. But sometimes people put up a barrier. And some of the things that have cropped up on it sometimes. Also, some folks have used her writings to abuse people, to force compliance for things. I know that for my dad's generation, he has some great stories. Stories about going into church when he was young and seeing the little old lady that came from down the street who just loved her cigars. And she wasn't an Adventist, but she would try to come to church every once in a while, and you could smell her coming. And they would say, here she comes. Oh no. And they would walk up to her, and they would pull out one of the diet and foods or the compilations on health or the ministry of healing and say, don't you know? And that little old lady just couldn't stop coming. We've used her that way sometimes. She's abused. She's used to drive people out, or she's used to make them comply. Sometimes we just ignore her because we don't like what she says. And this is the flip side of it. Either you love her and you use her to death, or you ignore her because you don't want her. And both of them are on two sides of the extreme, but they're a problem either way. We've got to find some middle ground here. What would she have wanted done? I think our biggest mistake, honestly, that has led up to a lot of these problems, the single biggest reason that we messed up with Ellen White is that we don't know how to read her in a logical and a thoughtful way. And I say that that's the crux of the problem, because if you can't read what she says and understand her meaning, you can attach anything you want to it. And this isn't just a problem with Ellen White. If you were here for my How to Study the Bible seminar, you'll see that that was the exact same thing we do the Bible sometimes. We read into stuff things that we like or that we want to hear, or things that we just don't know any better about because we don't take the time to study. The same thing can happen to Ellen White. We don't read her in a logical, thoughtful way. We're going to miss things. We're going to take her out of context. We aren't going to see the things from a 19th century perspective. We choose sometimes to only read and to quote single sentences and then assume that that one sentence is her entire opinion on the subject. That's a mistake. Anybody in here want to have a complete opinion about them based on a single sentence that a stranger overheard? I can guarantee all of us have said some things that would not want to be carried on for the posterity of the world. We can't sum up everything that we think or believe in a single sentence. So why do we try to do that with Ellen White? Single quotes do not create a theology. That's one of the things that I think we have a problem with. So I want to cover this morning how to read Ellen White. We first need to ask the question, what does the prophet mean by what the prophet says? That's the first place to start. You take a passage, you want to read something in Ellen White, you've got to start with, what does she mean? Where is she trying to say? Some of the pitfalls when we start to do this, though. The biggest danger that we have in reading the passage, in the Bible especially, is that you assume that your initial interpretation or your understanding of the verse is always accurate. One of the things I harped on in my How to Study the Bible class, don't assume that your first impression of the text is right every time. You can take your first impression and you can work on it and go back and say, is this there? Is this in other passages? Compare things back and forth. But if you assume that your first impression of the text is always right, you're guaranteed to make mistakes somewhere. And those mistakes can have ramifications. We also have another pitfall when reading this stuff with a 21st century glasses. Ellen White lived a long time ago. I said 200 years. It's actually not quite 200 years. But she lived in a world that's very different from ours. And if we try to read her world through 21st century eyes, we're going to miss stuff. In fact, we're going to give her definitions and reasons that she doesn't have. So what she has to say about this is some of the interesting stuff I wanted to read. If you can't read it, I'm going to just say it out loud for you here. Many men, she says, take the testimonies that the Lord has given, picking out a sentence here and there, taking it from its proper connection or context, and applying it according to their own idea. Thus, poor souls become bewildered when they could read in order all that has been given, so that they would see the true application and would not become confused. Much that purports to be a message from Sister White serves only the purpose of misrepresenting Sister White. So even in her own day, she said people are taking my quotes and my writings out of context, and they're saying things that I said that I didn't say. How much more of a danger is that once she's dead and can't stand up for herself? So we got these problems. And she says things that we sometimes have misinterpreted in the past. And this is just looking over the history of Adventism. Some of the things that we've purported Mrs. White says that have gotten a little mixed up sometimes. Health reform is a big one. Various sayings all over on that. I talk about health reform. There's also things on diet. We've had problems with dress. We've looked at the recreation and amusement over time. She had a very different opinion on amusement and recreation, but it was based in her world context in the 19th century. They were doing things that we don't even think of doing anymore. Different stuff was coming up. Sometimes we also had problems with education, both in theory and in practice. A lot of times she had ideas that were very revolutionary for her time, and we misapply what she was talking about. We misapply her ideas on religious experience, on religious practice, the way we run church. We also have racial issues that crop up. We look at some of the things that she says and say, see, this says we can divide ourselves according to race, segregate, people on. And that is perpetuated in some of the things in the church. There's cultural issues that come out. Very different culture, 19th century New England. New England itself, anybody from New England? Tell me it's a different culture. It's a little bit different than here over the West. Northwest even. Yeah, there's a different culture there. So not only is it regionally different, but it's also in time much different. We We've also got things that she talks about debt. We've had some issues there. We've had homemaking, different ideas like that. She's not exhaustive either. First, we've got the things that she says, and we've had some problems with that. But then there's the things that she doesn't say. Those trip us up too. We've had things where she doesn't have anything to say about, such as cinema and videos, obviously. No TVs back then, no big movies to watch like that. We don't have radio programs, anything on that. We don't have anything on television. We don't have anything on abortion. We don't have anything on cremation. We don't have anything on organ transplants. These are things that people have wanted to see in her to get questions answered, and they're just not there. Because she can't know things that she didn't have back then. There's future predictions, and then there's just regular culture. And God didn't see fit to explain all of these details. So sometimes we are stuck because we also can't apply questions that we have that she didn't even know about. So these are some of the things that kind of crop up here. And I want to give you guys some tools this morning on how we can avoid some of these errors. Some of these errors that I believe have damaged her reputation, and in the eyes of some people have damaged the relationship with the church. 3 rules of interpretation, and I'm going to give you guys some case studies on each one of these. Rule number 1. First thing, if you're going to go to Ellen White and you want to know about something, the first thing you need to do is to study all the passages where she talks about a subject before drawing your conclusions. And this is a key one, because like I said, we can take a couple of sentences in one subject, pull them out, and not look at the rest of it and get a different idea of what she thinks. In one hand, she can sit up and say, you should never have cheese and eggs and anything like that on your table. And another one, she says, you should put a little bit of cheese on your food. You need some protein. You should have some eggs. You should even have a little meat. She says this in 2 different places. But if you're only going to read one of them, you're going to act very differently. Because you're going to say, this is everything she says on the matter. So you've got to read all the passages before drawing your conclusions. Case study on this one. Eggs, anybody? Had some interesting stuff to say. In a sermon in Battle Creek, March 6, 1869, she says, you place upon your table butter, eggs, and meat, and your children partake of them. And then when you come to a meeting and ask God to bless and save your children, how high do you think your prayers go? It's a fairly harsh statement. Okay, it sounds like she's pretty against the ideas of eggs, cheese, dairy products. In another place, she writes to a brother and a sister E. She says, eggs should not be placed on your table. They are an injury to your children. Okay? Pretty blatant on that one. She's blunt. She's talking about eggs. Bad idea. So you're going to look at this and we're going to say, well, if these are the only 2 quotes that we chose to look at, you would think that it was a universal command that she was giving. No eggs, ever, anyway, nothing. But that's only if you use those 2 quotes. The rule says that you need to look at all the available passages on the subject before coming to a conclusion as to what she's saying. So, let's keep on looking. I've got a couple more verses, or a couple more passages that she threw out there. She says, in some cases, a person whose blood-making organs are feeble, example, anemia, milk and eggs should not be wholly discarded. Oh, that seems to be a little bit different. She's contradicting herself. What's going on here? We've got to keep reading. What else does she have to say on it? She says another place, while warnings have been given, yet we should not consider it a violation of principle to use eggs from hens that are well cared for and suitably fed. Eggs contain properties that are remedial agencies in counteracting certain poisons in the body. She's got, seems like a varying set of opinions here, but we're starting to get a sense that maybe it's not so one-sided. If there's 2 different opinions, 2 different things going on here, we have to assume that the middle ground is where she stands. Notice she's talking about something here. She says, the principle, right there. We should not consider it a violation of principle. I'm going to talk more about principle because this is another one of the underlying things that we have to focus on if we're to understand what she means. She sees this as an application of a principle. So she's looking at healthful living. She's looking at ways to be healthy. She applies that by saying we shouldn't say it's a violation if the eggs come from hens that are well cared for and suitably fed. What eggs would she then probably not be so keen on? Eggs from hens that are not well kept, or that have had disease, or that seem to be sick. She's not going to want those in the body. Duh, that makes sense. It's healthier to have eggs from a healthy chicken than from a not healthy one. She's not as unbalanced sometimes as things look when when you start to look at more than one passage on the subject. Another place, she actually has a Dr. Daniel Kress. This guy had become anemic from his abstinence of all animal products. He cut out everything that came from an animal, period. But the problem was that he didn't replace it with anything else. He just had vegetables and fruit. And there was proteins and nutrients that he was getting, which he had not found another way to get. And so he developed anemia and some other health problems. So specifically to this guy, she says this. She recommended that he change his eating habits, that she eat a raw egg and a glass of grape juice 2 or 3 times a day in order to receive the nourishment that he greatly needed. Now, frankly, that sounds disgusting. I hope it does to anybody else here too. But the fact of the matter is, here she is recommending that eggs be given to this guy as part of a supplement to his diet. So I'm getting a sense here. She talks to people about these things in a very specific way. To this guy, it was a letter written just for him, right? For his specific situation. The application was to have eggs in grape juice to supplement his diet. What's the principle that she was working from then? Use it for medicinal reasons? Do what's healthy, is what it kind of sounds like. Her principle was healthful living. And she would apply that depending on the person's situation. For some people who may have been eating dozens and dozens of eggs a week, she's probably going to say, get those eggs off your table. You are not doing yourself any good. You are becoming unhealthy. Your cholesterol is skyrocketing. She's going to say to that person, get rid of the eggs. Her principle is healthful lifestyle. The application is person-specific. So you've got to read more than one passage when you're going to read and study her, because then you're going to start to get a balanced perspective of what she's actually talking about. Second rule of interpretation. The time, the place, and the circumstances of the giving of certain messages should be considered. And I would say, honestly, have to be considered. Because as we said, this woman was born in the 19th century in a very different world. We have to look at the context, the history of what was going on around her when we read these passages. Now look at this one. That which can be said of men under certain circumstances, she says, cannot be said of them under other circumstances. What's she saying there? Context. She says you can't make a universal statement about somebody because the situation they're in sometimes changes. I can look at a man who's poor and say, boy, that guy, he needs $20 just to make it through the day. A couple of weeks later, suddenly he hits the jackpot, and I'm going to look at him and say, that guy, he doesn't need $20. Why do I change my mind? His circumstances change. And she was very clear on that. She says, you've got to take the context and situation if you're going to start to make universal statements. She says, God wants us all to have common sense. And He wants us to reason from common sense. Circumstances alter conditions, and circumstances change the relation of things. She's a very smart lady. She wasn't trying to beat people over the head. She was trying to use her brain, the thing that God gave her, to apply what she understood to specific situations. Look a little bit at this one. This was a pretty well-known, and if you've been in Adventist circles for a while, you've heard about her sayings on bicycles. One of my favorite ones. Just read it here real quick. She says, there seemed to be a bicycle craze. Money was spent to gratify an enthusiasm. Satan works with intensity of purpose to induce our people to invest their time and their money in gratifying supposed wants. This is a species of idolatry. There were some who were striving for the mastery, each trying to excel the other in the swift running of their bicycles. Okay, I've seen guys who were in the cars like that, frankly. Okay? You just gotta get the next best thing. You gotta make it a little bit faster, man. You gotta get the compression and rate higher. Make that thing louder. It's not different. It's just in bicycles. So she's talking against us, and she says it's a species of idolatry. It's kind of harsh. And over time, a lot of people back then said, Ellen White says not to buy bicycles. Made it a universal statement. For many years, bicycles were evil, bad. Because she just said it, didn't she? It's obvious. You gotta look at the context. You gotta see what's happening. You gotta look at the history of what's involved here. Understanding the context of the time when Ellen White made this comment is crucial to understanding what she really thought. The fad, it said, of buying bicycles showed, one, poor stewardship of time and money, and two, it gave give rise to competition, rivalry, and strive for supremacy. So she's seeing two problems here. She's not seeing the bicycle only. What she sees is people spending a lot of time and a lot of money on something that wasn't of value. And she saw also that the money that was being spent actually had the reverse effect. It just made these people want to be better and to beat the other guy, and it created competition and anger amongst people. She's just saying this is not a good thing. So she's not worried so much about the bicycle itself. Frankly, today, if she came into our church, she would probably have similar things to say about our cars, about our houses, about our cool cell phones, or whatever. She would say, that is not the best use of your money. You got to put it in the context, because she has a principle that's being used here. Don't spend your money on stuff that isn't necessary. Don't let things control your life. Don't try to beat the Joneses all the time. That's not what's important. That kind of a principle can be applied regardless of the time period. And it's going to change depending on the time period. Interesting quote here from a historian talking about this time frame. It says, towards the end of the last century, the American people were swept with a consuming passion which left them with little time or money for anything else. What was this big new distraction? America had discovered the bicycle, and everybody was making the most of the new freedom that it brought. The best early bicycle cost $150, an investment that was comparable to the cost of an automobile today. Every member of the family wanted a wheel, and the entire family savings often were used up on supplying the demand. Every person in your house gets a brand new car. Gonna hurt your finances? It's not going to be pretty. And this is what was happening. It was a fad, and it was taking over everywhere. People were spending massive amounts of money, and they were getting into financial ruin because of it. That's just history. That's not even Ellen White talking. So she's seeing it in the framework of principle and in the history of what was going on. We can't now, in the 21st century, be going around telling everybody you shouldn't be buying bicycles. That's not her point. The point is, look where you're spending your money. Don't use it for useless things. Rule number 3, one should try to discover the principle involved in any specific counsel and then its applications. And I've already kind of alluded to this. The principle of something has to be what is discovered first, and the application second. And in her writings, she's working from principle many, many times. What is a principle? Principle is the unerring, unchanging rule of human conduct or behavior. Example, love your neighbor as yourself. That has a universal and an eternal meaning, or a principle. Love your neighbor as yourself. How you choose to go about loving your neighbor as yourself is going to change for every one of us. Our means are different. Our experiences are different. How do you apply a principle? You take principles and apply them based on the specific situation. You need something like a gigantic Swiss Army knife. Tools for every deal. Okay, you got to figure out the tool that's needed for the job that needs to be done, but you work from a basic principle to do it. Application of the principles can change as circumstances which call them forth change. So we've got to take principles and we've got to use them like tools. We can't take a principle, stick it in stone, and say this is the same principle and application for all eternity. Otherwise, none of us can ride bicycles. Got to use context. Got to use the principle behind stuff. Case study. This one was an interesting one. I've actually, in college, I was in a church as a student pastor who was arguing about how to pray. And I don't mean just how to verbally pray. There were people who said you've got to pray on your knees every time, and there was other people who said you've got to stand up every time. And they were both quoting Ellen White in support of their arguments. And literally half the church during church service, on this side of the church, everybody here would pray on their knees. The other half were all standing. And it was such an obvious split, you know, you're just like, wow, this is a really interesting church. And so they were using this stuff back and forth. Here's a quote here she has to say about this. She says, I have received letters questioning me in regard to the proper attitude to be taken by a person offering prayer to the sovereign of the universe. Where have our brethren obtained the idea that they should stand upon their feet when praying to God? One who has been educated for about 5 years in Battle Creek was asked to lead prayer before Sister White should speak to the people. So the pastor's getting ready to have the opening prayer for church. Ellen White's ready to preach. She says, but as I beheld him standing upright, the upon his feet while his lips were about to open in prayer to God. My soul was stirred within me to give him an open rebuke. Calling him by name, I said, get down upon your knees. This is the proper position always. Okay, those were the passages that was quoted by those who said you got to pray on your knees all the time. It's fairly convincing. She's not being unclear here, right? But what's the principle we got to use here? Okay, I was actually sorry. What's the interpretive principle? The first rule number 1. Look at all the passages. Don't just take one of them first. So you got to look at everywhere that she talks about this. So, how should we pray? She goes on and says, first you got to study all the passages. And here's what she starts to say in other places. She says we must pray constantly with a humble mind and a meek and lowly spirit. We need not wait for an opportunity to kneel before God. We can pray and talk with the Lord wherever we may be. She goes on in another place and says, you cannot always be on your knees in prayer, but your silent petitions may constantly ascend to God for strength and for guidance. It is not always necessary to bow upon your knees in order to pray. Ministry of healing. Starting to get a sense here. Is she as clear-cut and universal as that first one makes it sound? No, not quite. She sounds something else is going on here. She's not black and white yet. So she keeps on going here in a couple other passages. I was not able, she says, to bow my knees in the opening prayer or when I entered the desk or the pulpit, as I usually do. But the form is not the essential part. My heart went up to God in earnest prayer, and he did help me, and I believe gave me a decided message for the people attending. She says that it didn't matter the form. The real issue was the heart. And she believes God blessed her regardless of the fact that she wasn't able to get down on her knees. What are the principles we're talking about here then? Based on these passages, what is she seeing? Principle is reverence. She stands up for reverence. That's very clear from the first quote. She says that is how you need to be. If you are to come before the Father, there is reverence involved. Second thing she says is you have to have some dependence on God. Prayer is not about coming and demanding. She says prayer is about depending on a Father who is willing to give. But it's still his prerogative. We come to him as the lesser, as the petitioner, as the one who's asking. So these are the principles she's talking about. We apply those principles in our daily lives. Reverence, you apply that. Dependence, you apply that. Everybody's going to look a little bit different. But if we're all going towards those principles, things are going to work out. Following these 3 simple rules. First one, compare all your passages. The next one, take the context of the passage into mind. And the third one, look for principles and then make your applications. Those 3 rules will help us avoid extremism in our understanding of Ellen White's writings. Properly understanding these writings, truly, in my mind, is what matters the most. Because you can do a lot of damage if you just take a cursory glance over this stuff. You can do a lot of damage if you do this in the Bible. If we want to sit down and beat somebody over the head, the easiest way to do it is to take one verse that agrees with what we say and nothing else. Happens all the time. We've got to use these principles because if we don't, we go to the point where we misrepresent God himself. The Bible can't be used like a battering ram. It's not what he wanted. He wanted to appeal to people's hearts, their minds, and to reach out and change lives, not push them out. So these principles, these ideas are important. Also, seeing the truthfulness of this message is what ultimately will transform our lives. Because honestly, if you come out with an opinion that's very black and white and has no reference to context or anything else, you may change how you act towards people, and you're always going to stay that way because you don't think the message ever changes. You don't look at the principles, you don't see how to apply them, and you miss out on the blessing that that message is supposed to have for you. God doesn't want us to be ignorant. He looks at us in our situations and says, you could be so much happier if you just understood. And rightly understanding the messages that he's already given us is the only way we have to work towards that goal. I tell you, the Spirit is the only one who's going to help us with this. None of us are going to be able to figure it out perfectly every time. Before I ever study anything, I try to get down and I pray, Lord, help me to understand. Remove the biases from my mind and my heart. Give me eyes that can see the issues for what they are. And I pray that every time, because otherwise, I don't believe I can come to this stuff on my own. I ain't perfect. I don't understand everything. But I have a God who does. This afternoon, we're going to talk about one last thing. These are a couple different issues, but I believe there are other big issues that really can get in the way of our understanding of Ellen White. We're going to look at how to deal with contradictions in her writings. Because there are things that come up. I already mentioned the one about the eggs, and the guy that said, don't have it on your table, and the one that said, do have it on your table. We're going to look at what she had to say about vegetarianism. It's really interesting. Ellen White ate meat early on in her life. She said she ate a lot of meat. And she went on the other side of things and said, never eat meat at all. Which one do you go for? There's contradictions if you just look at them plainly like that. We're going to kind of review what she's got to say on some of those things. We're also going to look at some of the problem statements. And I say problem statements because we look at some of the things that she says and we think, wow, that's a little crazy. She actually said in one part that wearing wings can kill you. Exactly. I kind of chuckled when I read that one too. You got to look at things. You got to use the tools. If we want to understand what she's talking about here, we got to use the tools. I'm not going to give it away. You guys got to come this afternoon. Next, we're going to look at her relationship to the Bible. This is one of the ones that I believe is the biggest problem for non-Adventists to get past. And sometimes hard for us to get past. Because the relationship of Ellen White to the Bible, how can she still have authority if she's supposed to be the lesser light? There's a lot of people who look and say Ellen White is just as inspired as the Bible. They're equal. It's a hard balance to play, really, because if you believe she's a prophet and that God spoke to her, then you're going to believe what she says. And you believe that the Bible was given through prophets. God spoke to them. How do you balance it? If she's lesser, how do we do that? What's the relationship? Who's involved? We're going to get into that one. That one's, to me, the crux of how we preach Ellen White to non-Adventists. And ultimately, I think it's the point where a lot of people just look at it and say, you guys are a cult. Crazy. So if you want to come and learn a little bit more about that one, please do come and check it out. I want to thank you guys. I don't... It's just really good to be back. I enjoy you guys. And I want to thank you for allowing me to come back and share with you. Bow your heads with me, please. Jesus, I want to thank you for your gifts. You've given us mercy, grace. You've given us the Bible. And you've also given us the spirit of prophecy. You've gone out of your way to try everything you can to get us back home. And Lord, if we have rejected and pushed away and misused some of these gifts, I pray that you forgive us today. Give us wisdom. Give us grace. And most of all, give us your love. We ask these things in Jesus' name.